I will be quite brief to try and assist the speaker in gaining on the time that he said we should try and help on. Um, so I have a presentation which I'll make. I'll try and do it in about 15 minutes or so. But I've had the privilege of sharing it on soft copy with your secretariat here, so that at a later stage you can have time to interrogate it. And we'd be very happy to get your feedback after you've had that opportunity to interrogate it. Basically, when I was invited by the speaker, I tried to figure out how to explain the linkage between Parliament and the executive. And I thought I would be a little bit provocative. So I have titled my comments as Some Inconvenient Truths and Going Beyond Business as Usual. We have to start coming to terms with some of the new realities and to see how to operate. So, Mr. Speaker, Honorable Moses Masika Wetangula, the Assembly leadership, honorable members, and the Secretary General of the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association, Honorable Stephen Twigg. Mr. Speaker, this seminar has asked me to speak to the linkage between Parliament and the executive. Ordinarily, this topic inadvertently invites me to first explain the role of the Office of the Prime Cabinet Secretary, and second, its linkage to Parliament. The convenient thing to do would be just to draw your attention to Executive Order Number 1 of January 2023, which outlines the functional roles of this office. And these are coordination and supervision of government ministries and state departments, overseeing the implementation of the national government policies, programs, and projects, chairing and coordinating national government legislative agenda across all ministries and state departments in consultation with and for transmission to the party coalition leaders in Parliament. I'll also be chairing the Principal Secretaries Committees and engage in the supervising and technical monitoring and evaluation of government policies and programs. I would then easily tabulate how these functions intersect with the roles of Parliament in legislating, representation, allocation of national revenue, and oversight roles that gel with executive roles of originating bills and implementation of legislation, policy formulation, and service delivery. However, to do justice at this important seminar, I have recently learned through a fresh happening in this forum and my own earthquake phenomena experience that sometimes you need to be destructive in order to construct. That change comes only after discomfort. I have therefore deliberately tweaked the title of my presentation, as I said, to read Linkage Between Parliament and the Executive, Some Inconvenient Truths, Going Beyond Business as Usual. Let me touch on some of the inconvenient truths. The Constitution is 12 years old. But how often, as leaders, have we or do we reflect on Chapter 6 on leadership and integrity? Specifically, the following articles. Article 73, responsibilities of leadership. 74, the oath of office of state officers. 75, conduct of state officers. 76, probity of state officers. 77, restriction on activities of state officers. 78, citizenship and leadership. 79, legislation to establish the Ethics and Anti-Corruption Commission. 80, legislation on leadership. Further, how about Article 10 and its 17 national values, the obligations on representation of the people in Chapter 7, the fidelity of Chapter 12 on public finance, Chapter 13 guidelines on public finance management, and the subsequent laws that operationalize these chapters of the Constitution. If I dare ask, how many of us can recite 2 national values? The inconvenient truth is that these chapters and the articles in the Constitution on leadership activities are adhered to in default rather than in observance. Could it be that they escape our attention because they are inconvenient to our well-being? Let's take the following issues, for example. Corruption. It is no secret that corruption has been a persistent problem in our country. As leaders, we must be prepared to face it head-on. The second one is lack of political will. Often, we take political will to mean risk. In policy implementation, we hesitate to take bold decisions in the best interests of citizens, out of fear of the unknown or simply because a policy does not align with personal or political interests. The other thing is lack of transparency. Lack of political will is a cousin of lack of transparency in public processes. And lack of transparency has an uncle in corruption. When processes are opaque and not easily accessible to the public, citizens suspect incestuous relationships and cannot trust or even hold leaders accountable. Let me also touch on political polarization. Political polarization is very detrimental to decision-making in resource allocation. Consensus in policy-making and legislation is the casualty of political polarization in favor of inertia and myopia. Hence, in a highly polarized political landscape, with different ethnic and regional leadership, often taking opposing positions on mundane issues, and decision-making slows, and the scales are tilted unfavorably against national development. Let us also look at briefly the issue of inadequate policy coordination. Inadequate policy coordination is a twin to lack of skills and expertise, capacity in policy initiation and implementation. In such an environment, coordinated outputs are difficult to some public officials. Thus, government ministries, agencies, and departments work in silos, leading to duplication, turf wars, and inefficiency. This is when the death of effective policy initiatives, implementation, evaluation, and monitoring occurs. Lethargy then occupies public offices rather than skilled officers. And blame games are formalized as government communication. So, how does the office of the Prime Minister sit in this background that I've put across? The coordination and supervision of government ministries, state departments, and agencies' role is not only just meant to ensure effective whole government and open government and effective delivery of services, but also inbuilt with its fulfillment of the commitment to enhance parliamentary oversight of the executive for increased public accountability. In this role, the Office of the Prime Cabinet Secretary has direct and indirect links to Parliament through the twin function of chairing and coordinating national government legislative agenda across all ministries and state departments, and chairing the principal secretaries' committees. This means dealing with matters and functions relating to Parliament as the liaison office between the executive and Parliament, identifying policy, legal, and institutional reforms needed to implement the government agenda, oversight to ensure public participation and the involvement of other stakeholders in the development of bills by the various ministries, departments, and agencies. And honorable members, the issue of public participation has cost a lot of legislation. That is usually the Waterloo. We also have to monitor and evaluate the progress of policies and legislation to ensure the objects of the national government intended in the legal framework are within the constitutional framework and achieved in time. To illustrate the interplay between the executive and Parliament, it is worth noting that some parliamentary resolutions need interventions by the executive to be actualized. When Parliament sends resolutions to the respective ministries and departments and agencies for action, the tracking of and response time to these resolutions must be enhanced by the establishment of the Prime Cabinet Secretary's Office. In addition, bills passed by Parliament that have tremendous impact on priorities of national and county government's agenda will get priority watch. It is therefore important to centrally identify such actionable bills, track them, and ensure timely implementation. A fully fledged State Department for Parliamentary Affairs has been created for this purpose, and I'm happy that the Speaker has introduced the Permanent Secretary here, the Principal Secretary. And this department is tasked with communication of policy directions to Parliament, development and implementation of a framework to track and monitor bills for legislation in Parliament, ensure quality research and analysis to advise on existing legislative gaps, and ensure action and response to instructions and requests from Parliament. Complementing that department is the State Department of Performance and Delivery Management, which will deal with matters of performance contracting and delivery of public services within the executive, as well as oversight the implementation of national government policies, programs, and projects. This is why, and it's important for Parliament to note this, is that the Office of the Prime Cabinet Secretary hosts oversight agencies that include the Government Delivery Services. This was previously the PDU, the State Corporations Advisory Committee, the Inspectorate of State Corporations, and the Performance Contracting and Monitoring Unit. These are agencies that will be available for us to work with you. Now, in order to appreciate how the Office of the Prime Cabinet Secretary can help to improve execution of House resolutions, we have done a review of the status of the implementation of the House resolutions from the 12th Parliament. And this is what we found. The 12th Parliament sent 247 items for action by various ministries, departments, and government agencies. To date, items marked as not done are a monstrous 135. That is 54.7%. And out of this, 65% of the 135 items were first tabled in Parliament more than 3 years ago. Ongoing items are 34%, which translates to 34, which translates only to 13.8%. And those done are 78, and it translates to 31.5%. This, on average, is a completion rate of only 31.5% for resolutions spanning more than 5 years since tabling, and therefore one can see clearly that there's a very low implementation rate of parliamentary resolutions. In the matter of fast-tracking parliament resolutions, we will intervene in the following manner. We will incorporate a resolutions tracker into its overall tracking tool dashboard to ensure, that is the office's tool, to ensure that the visibility of resolutions is maintained until action is completed. We will be requesting Parliament to also copy our office any communication they make with the various ministries, departments, and agencies, so that we can also assist in the follow-up. We will want to carry out regular consultations with the House in matters that need prioritization and fast-tracking. We will also, through the Principal Secretaries Committee, provide a platform to resolve multi-sector stakeholder or multi-stakeholder complex issues, because, as I said, sometimes people work in silos, so this office will provide an opportunity for us to collate all these issues and deal with them as we should. Detailed proposals for the implementation framework, mechanisms and strategies to improve the engagement between the executive and Parliament are in a soft copy, as I indicated to you, and we have handed them over. They'll be attached to these remarks that I'm making. In the meantime, to make the executive and Parliament liaison process more productive, I would request that Parliament could review its communication processes to rope us in. Parliament should constantly update our office on its committees and House calendars with the aim of us assisting and making sure that scheduling and reporting and presentation dates by various ministries is handled effectively. This, ladies and gentlemen, if we work together with all the stakeholders, I think we can serve the Kenyan people better with the leverage of Parliament to guide us. Allow me just to highlight one or two executive expectations that we need from Parliament. First, I'll flag the privatization bill, 2023. Ladies and gentlemen, privatization has stalled. It has stalled. It's not moving at all. And earlier when I was listening to the conversation in this building, in this house, there was the issue of where does the government look for resources? And it was clear that nobody wants to hear about any new taxation. Ladies and gentlemen, one way of the government raising resources to undertake certain programs is through privatization of various state entities. So I'll be appealing to Parliament that since the Privatization Commission and Treasury have finalized the draft bill and submitted it for public participation, we'll be looking forward to the Assembly or Parliament to help us so that we can fast-track this kind of bill. The other thing that I would just want to talk on is more of something that I feel strongly about, and I'll sum it up in 3 words. This is the matter of growth, equity, and sustainability. Growth, equity, and sustainability. In short, GES, or you can just have it as GES. Now, these are basic principles, and I would like us to just reflect on when we push legislation, whether it is a private member-sponsored legislation, or it's even within the government, or it's a petition emanating from a petition of a citizen, and it's going to be translated into law, we need to ask ourselves, does that law have provisions that can lead to growth in our economy? Does that law have the principle of equity? Is there common good across the board? And is that law and what it seeks to achieve, is it sustainable? If a piece of legislation does not reflect the principle of growth, does not reflect the principle of equity, and does not appear to be sustainable, then is it really worth being translated into legislation? These are the fundamental questions that we really need to ask ourselves. So whether we are looking at taxation, policies that would reduce income inequality, fund programs, then we must judge that piece of legislation based on those three principles. If it is something that is going to address climate change, investment in renewable energy, to help sustain sustainability in that area, that the negative impacts of climate change, then we must ask ourselves, if the principles are there, then it seems to be sound legislation. Does it uplift the small and medium-sized enterprises? We want equity. Are we seeing legislation that brings out growth, equity, and sustainability? Are we bringing in legislation that will anchor housing, healthcare, childcare, to ensure that everybody is able to earn a decent living and to pay for their health? Is that legislation available? Ask yourself as a rule of thumb, when you bring your piece of legislation, does it cover that? And I'll give an example of some extreme pieces of legislation that have been there in the past. They can sometimes look very popular, but they can be very devastating. Let me give the example of the Donde Bill. The Donde Bill, which was a buzzword in the country for some time, was a bill that sought to try and reintroduce price controls in the system, but starting with interest rates. So it looked very popular. Everybody would like to pay a loan, but at a modest interest rate, including me. But at the end of the day, it was a piece of legislation that disrupted the entire economic fabric, and it actually caused a curtailment of foreign direct investment and even foreign assistance to the government of Kenya until Parliament, I think it should be was it the 11th Parliament? After reflection and after the ping pong, you reversed it and put an end to that particular piece of legislation. So we need to look at it and say, when I'm bringing up that piece of legislation, what is going to be the overall impact, not to me as an individual, but to the entire country. Another awkward piece of legislation was the legislation that made Kenya a one-party state. You remember that bill that dealt with section... Yeah, 2A. You remember that piece of legislation, you know? Again, it sounded popular. It was rushed, you know, and we pushed it, but, you know, as a nation. And the consequences were severe because it was a serious aggression on democracy and constitutionalism, and it was so damaging that, again, the international community walked out on Kenya until that piece of legislation was repealed 10 years later. So you count the number of years lost when people are haggling over that, the impact on the country's reputation, on the country's ability to harness direct investment and so forth. So, ladies and gentlemen, I was just trying to highlight some of these things Not that you don't know, I know you know about it. You think about it every other time. After all, you're the one sitting in the hot seat in this context. But it is sometimes not too bad for us to remind ourselves that at times, broad consultation and the public participation envisaged in the Constitution will be very, very helpful. So, the office of the Prime Cabinet Secretary is there, and as I think it was the Speaker and somebody who brought it out, I offer myself to you on this one as somebody who is a politician. I've also been a member of Parliament, I've been a minister, I've been a political party leader, I have been a presidential aspirant, I've been the shortest serving vice president. But all this wealth of experience, I think if we partner with you, if we work with you, we can help in getting very critical legislation that is beneficial to the people of Kenya out of the way. And we can also make it useful. So, I come back to my 3 principles: growth, equity, sustainability. As you reflect, as you debate here, if you can persuade the nation that there is growth in your legislation, there is equity in your legislation, and it is sustainable, then I am sure we'll be on the right track and we'll be able to change things for the better in this country. So, ladies and gentlemen, I think I'll end there. I hope I've helped in minimizing the loss of time, but I wish you success in your deliberations, and I hope we can engage further and see how we can improve to deliver for the people of Kenya. And please send us your feedback once you get access to this documentation. Asanteni sana, and have a good afternoon.